So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon, classmates. I am the second reporter of the topic, the practice of civil engineering, and my topic is all about the section 1.3 to 1.3.3. So I am Christian Mark Mabido. So let's proceed to our topic. So if you hear the word or if you read the word relationship, what comes from your mind? It is maybe a relationship, a couple relationship, or maybe a friend relationship, or family relationship, or best friend. But in civil engineering also has a relationship. So sa civil engineering di ay naapoy ginatawag na relationship. So let's tackle about the relationship in civil engineering. So client civil engineering relationship, section 1.3. So before we proceed to the section 1.3, so let's watch together a video about career conversion as civil engineering in action. So let's listen carefully because we will. Yes.
Civil engineering has various specializations such as structural engineering, hydraulics, transportation, technical, sanitary, and many more. It's fundamentally about solving problems and explain the means to apply existing knowledge. My education greatly helped me gain the thorough understanding of the basic concepts of engineering. It also taught me how to calculate estimate flexibility of structure using math and physics. Also, even if a good problem solver, also be proud of science. For every structure you see, a civil engineer surely had a major part in it, as we have to work on a project from its inception up to its completion.
Ang alam kasi ng tao about civil engineering is sila yung nag-construct ng mga roads, bridges, and structures natin. Pero there's more to it. So nakikipag-work ako din kay structural engineer kung kumusta na yung mga structural designs natin para pwede na ba sila, good for construction na ba. Ito, we work naman with the mechanical engineers kasi dahil natin ito, marami tayong mga equipments na kailangan ipasa. Kailangan mo kasi ng massive na technical training. Kasi yung work namin as a civil engineer involves hydraulics, structural engineering, project management. So yung mga bagay na yun, malalearn mo lang siya, yung mga basic principles niya. Ang misconception kasi sa civil engineer more on high-rise buildings, roads, pero dito kasi ano siya, combination siya ng electromechanical treatment plants, pumping stations, mga reservoirs, dam, kung mahilig kayo mag-solve ng mga problems, yung mga talagang mapapa-improve ka. And then, yun, siguro high critical thinking skills. Second is yung leadership quality. First, as a civil engineer, dapat nalilid yung team mo para ma-deliver yung project. And then third, siguro, yung written communication skills. Kasi di ba sa project implementation, kailangan lahat ng agreements yung written. For someone who would like to be a civil engineer, dapat mahal mo yung trabaho mo and gusto mo talaga itong ginagawa mo. Because when you do what you love, it makes everything easier. The deeper yung bakit mo siya ginagawa, nagiging madali kasi kung paano mo siya gawin.
Many engineers would say that the road to success is always under construction, which I believe is true. Because success is not definite. It is a continuous journey in which you need to put a lot of hard work and effort in order to attain, but it never ends. I am Edison Malayto. I am a structural engineer.
I am Kisha Manina, civil engineer.
I am Judy Manalang. I am a civil engineer.
I am for edukasyon.
So sa video nga na ato ang napaminawan guys is a civil engineer is not working alone. So we need to cooperate to other engineers or uh, in simple words, we should strengthen our relationship to others. So that our work or our um, projects would be done accordingly. So it is important in civil engineering that ang ato ang relationship is naga naga-grow. So many engineering works are conceived, designed, and constructed through the effort of civil engineers employed in the governmental agencies or industry. Other engineering projects come to fruition through the effort of civil engineering firms engaged for a specific project or program by a public agencies or private clients. Many public and private entities of necessity rely on civil engineers as their employees. So civil engineers plays a big role in our society, guys. So as a civil engineers, we should put a good relationship towards others para because kaya ano mo sa magitan to sa tong palibot is um nadyo kinalaman sa civil engineering, sa road, buildings, schools, or any kinds of mga kung mga to buildings na ay contribution ang civil engineer. So as a civil engineers kailangan nato ang atong relationship is dili siya maguba sa uban tungod kay kay makipag-connect man ta sa uban, for example sa mga mechanical engineers or sa mga structural engineers or sa iba pang clients nga pwede na to makonect ang ato ang work. So independent civil engineering firms are also relied upon to accomplish project which required special expertise beyond the normal capabilities or of the client. So more recently, clients have been utilizing new concepts such as program management and design build to implement projects. So muna guys nga akong ginaingon nga a civil engineer should have a good relationship towards the others because in everything in our society na-adjoy big role or place ang isa ka civil engineer. So muna siya nga importante ang relationship towards others. So tapos na ta sa relationship. So let's topic about the obligation of civil engineer. So it is topic na fall siya sa section 1.3.1. So naay apat ka nine obligation of a civil engineer. So first, the civil engineer shall perform scope excuse me of the service as stated in section 2. So this section 2 matopic na siya sa ibang mga reporters. So we will not discuss further about this section 2. So let's proceed. The civil engineer shall exercise reasonable skills, care, and diligence in the performance of his obligation. So kailangan as a civil engineer ka, ang imong skills is i-exercise nimo sa imong mga client. For example, pagbuhat og mga design sa building or pagbuhat sa maging bisan ang relationship nimo sa client is imuhang i-build para maging successful ang imuhang project. The civil engineering shall act independently and as required by the contract, perform with the necessary skills and professional judgment. When required to certify, decide, or exercise discretion between the client and a third party with whom the client has contract. So, muna ang number 3. Number 4, the civil engineer is authorized to act as the client faithful agent when required but only as implied in section 2 or implied in the contract adopted for the project. So, the civil engineer daw is siya lang ang authorized to act as the client faithful agent when required. So, this topic or this obligation of civil engineer discuss na siya further sa mga iban pa nga reporter sa section 2 nga report. So, we'll proceed. When aware of any matters which will change or has changed the scope of the services, the civil engineer shall give written notice to the client containing particular of the change. So, if you are civil engineer, if naay mga motaingon gina sa video nga, a civil engineer is mura siya nabuhi or circulate sa written report or sa written o sa mga written kumbaga written reports because para practical nga or mabasa sa client o sa civil o sa engineer. So, yun diri the civil engineer shall give written notice to the client containing particular of the change. So, ang civil engineer if naay sabon or naay ilisdan sa project or naay mga new ideas, kailangan siya maghatag og written notice sa client nga na siya giusab. So, amo na siya ang isa sa mga obligation sa civil engineer. For specified stage services, the civil engineer shall not initiate or proceed with any subsequent stage of the service without the approval of the client. So muna siya ang ginatawag nga dili ta magbuot-buot. So as a civil engineer, so kung unsa tong napirmahan, unsa ang nasa plano or unsa ang nasa kumbaga blueprint is dili na to siya usabon without the consent or the approval of the client. For example, um ang iyahang roof deck is giatupan nimo. So without notice or without written notice sa imuhang client, so maging conflict mo dira sa inyong project. So we should contact our client or we need approval sa atong client kung natay usabon or natay i-change sa ato ang mga project or sa ato ang mga buildings nga ginabuhat. So number 7, when required, the civil engineer shall direct and cooperate with all the professional and integrate their work where applicable into that being undertaken by civil engineering and other professional but shall not be professionally liable for their works. So muna siya ang number 7 guys. Number 8, the civil engineer may recommend specialist supplier and or contractor to design and execute pertinent parts of works, in which case the civil engineer shall coordinate the design of such part or parts with the overall design of the work, but he shall believe or of all responsibility for the design, manufacture, installation, and performance of any such part or parts of the work. The civil engineer shall not be liable for act of negligence, default, or omission by such person to person. So, isa po sa obligation sa civil engineer guys is kung pwede siya for example sa design sa isa ka balay. So pwede siya mo recommend o isa ka architect or para mga designer nga mo design sa balay sa iyang client tapos siya lang ang ah, mag mag-install or mag-work. So muna siya nga ang isa sa mga obligation sa civil engineer. The civil engineer shall notify the client of any interest the civil engineer has which may significantly conflict with the interest of the client under their contract. So muna siya ang number 9 nga obligation of the civil engineer. So obligation of the client. So gayon na guys na siya natin obligation of the civil engineer. So napo ay obligation sa client ay napo day obligation ang mga client. So di lang day ang civil engineer because it is a two-way contract between a civil engineer and the client. So di lang man kay civil engineer ka ikaw ang nangita og client or ikaw ang karang o kumbaga nangita client ikaw lang na obligation but the client also na po siya obligation because naay contract na ginapirmahan og naay karang karang kasulatan or written nga mga contract. So, obligation of the client section 1.3.2. Number 1, the obligation of the client include number 1, the client shall pay the civil engineer for his services, the amount of fees and expenses set out in or determined in their agreement. So, as a client guys, we should pay the civil engineers kung unsa man ang naabot or pila ang amount nga nagamit or nahurot sa isimuhang ginapatukod nga project or maybe simuhang balay. So we should pay the civil engineers siyang professional fee or maybe siyang siyang trabaho because as a civil engineer it is a work nga naay pay dili siya libre. So basically kung magpatukod tag balay or mag-hire tag engineer, kailangan nato siya bayaran yang service, yang professional fee, and also the materials nga gigamit sa pagtukod sa imong balay or sa imong establishment or maybe mga building. Next, the client shall provide the civil engineering within reasonable time. So, isa ni sa mga big factor sa client kay because for example, ang isa ka civil engineer nag nag-set siya nga ang time frame is 6 to 8 months tapos na ang imuhang building or imuhang residential house. But ikaw nga client ginadugay nimo o ginapadugay nimo ang imuhang mga materials, imuhang mga budget, so ma-conflict na sa contract sa gibuhat sa civil engineering. So as a client, i-provide yun nato provide the civil engineer within the reasonable time. So kailangan nato ma-provide. So if ever mapatukod ka, mag-ask yun ka kung pilay budget o kaya na pa jud kara nga budget. So next the client shall cooperate with the civil engineer and shall not interfere with or obstruct the proper performance of the service. So as a client ka, dili ka pwede mag-interfere sa work sa civil engineer because ang civil engineer siya ang responsible or siya ang accountable ang mga butang or mga bagay nga siyang project. So if you are the client, maybe you will suggest lang but you will not interfere. So wala siya ang isa sa mga obligations as a client. The client shall as soon as practicable make arrangement to enable the civil engineer to enter the site and inspect facilities needed in the performance of his service. So as soon as possible as soon as practicable, kailangan na to ma-clear ang site nga para ma-inspect na siya sa civil engineer o maplanuhan na niya unsa kada yang dako ang area, unsa kadako ang cost or pila ang maabot sa cost sa imong balay or unsa ang design ang pwede buhaton na because kailangan mo na tan-awo ng area sa nga itukod nga tukuran para makaplano gyud ang isa ka civil engineer. The client shall arrange for the provision of the service from other professional or others as may be required and bear all costs. So the client shall arrange for the provision of the service. So i-arrange yun sa client. So muna siyang sa mga obligation sa client. So number 6, when the civil engineer is required to administer the work of other professional or other third parties who are directly contracted by the client or when the civil engineer is required to act as engineer to the contract for any contract on behalf of the client, then all instruction by the client shall be given through the civil engineer. So this is the sixth obligation of the client. And lastly, when aware of any matter will change or has changed the scope of the civil engineer services, the client shall notify in writing 7 days the civil engineering containing as far as practicable the particular of the change. So if ever na makagusto ipausab, nakagusto ipa-change sa imuhang project engineer, kailangan ka mag-write mo gina written report jud ang naga-circulate or ang kailangan sa isa ka civil engineer o siyang client. So dili siya verbal, dili pud siya karang text lang kundi written report. So within 7 days kailangan siya i-provide sa client para ma-notice sa engineer or ma-notice sa mga project engineer nga na day mga change nga buhaton. So if ever kung naay obligation ang isa ka civil engineer, so napod di ay obligation ang ato ang mga client. So mo na siya ang 7 obligation nga na nasulod sa section 1.3.2. So and lastly, the section 1.3.3, liability of the civil engineer and the client. So no, liability of the civil engineer and the client. Section 1.3.3. The civil engineer shall only be liable to pay the damages to the client arising out or in connection with the agreement if a breach of duty of cares is established against the civil engineer. Next, the client shall only be liable to pay the damage to civil engineer if is breach of the client's duty to the civil engineer is established against the client. So next, resolution of any conflict arising from the agreement between the civil engineer and the client shall be done by giving preference to the process of arbitration. And lastly, establishment of the breach of duty of the part of civil engineer and that of the breach of the client duty to the civil engineer shall be undertaken by a third party arbitrator mutually acceptable to the client and the civil engineer. So this four is the liability of civil engineer and the client. So and that's all. That would be all. Thank you so much for listening and thank you.